you have witnessed the acceptable year of the Lord. Now I'm gonna take a couple years off, and then we'll get started. Right?
There's one heretic, I will say, in the 4th century who denied 300 years of testimony and said Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years.
There not only were no Greek Gospels at the time, there were no Greek believers at the time.
Right, these are Samaritans.
Right, so
they write in Paleo-Hebrew to this day. They speak in Hebrew.
Right, so who's going to be calling him the Christ before there are any Greek believers or any Greek Gospels?
For most people out there, they don't know how the chronology lays out. Because the Gospels are laid out, the context really is Yeshua fulfilling what every male Israelite must do, must perform. Every male Israelite must go up to the feast of the Lord at Jerusalem 3 times a year. And the Gospels are the record of him going up to each one of these feasts. We see the first Passover that Yeshua goes up to after his mikvah, after his immersion, is the Passover in John chapter 2 and 3.
Right.
Then, after Passover, the next feast is Shavuot. That is John chapter 5. And those who understand the feast of Shavuot know very clearly exactly how it transpires, what happens there, and this is very clearly Shavuot. Or Pentecost. But anyone in the Gentile world would have no idea what this is about because they know nothing about the feast.
Right, so that's why John includes all the feast days, totally unnecessary for the Hebrews. They don't need that. But the Greek readers, it's required for them to understand it.
Right.
But they don't know much about it, so they just simply got some things wrong in their...
Right, but what we have is John 2 and 3, Passover. The next feast he goes up to in John 5 is the Feast of Shavuot. Then we have the next feast, which is the Feast of Sukkot in John chapter 7. Then the next feast that he goes up to is Hanukkah in John chapter 8 through 10.
Right.
And then he comes back at the time of Purim and raises Lazarus from the dead, but neither Purim nor Hanukkah are the feasts of the Lord. These are specified as Jewish feasts. Memorials like our Thanksgiving in America. That is an American feast, but it's a thanksgiving to God. Okay, but the next feast he must go up to, and it shows us, is John chapter 12. Yeshua goes up to Passover, in which he is crucified. Okay. All the early church fathers all said Yeshua's ministry was about 1 year. It is one heretic, I will say, in the 4th century who denied 300 years of testimony and said Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years.
And that was the first time that theory was heard of.
That's right. And so what happened at that point is that a feast of the Lord appears in John chapter 6. A feast of the Lord at the feeding of the 5,000 at the end of the summer. We're coming up on fall, and all of the gospel authors record the feeding of the 5,000, but in John, there were words that were added to later Greek text. That says, in Passover, a feast of the Jews was nigh. With that Passover, that destroys the 1 year ministry.
It does.
That all the early church fathers said. And so then we found manuscripts that John 6:4 is not there at all. It was a forgery that was added in an attempt to lengthen his ministry artificially to come up with a nonsensical, absolutely ridiculous 3.5 year ministry.
Right.
That's where you got involved.
Yes, and the viewer should know that Michael never asked me to do this, but like Michael, I recognize that this is a key to the truth of the Gospels and to the messing around with Scripture that the Greeks had done. Now, the insertion, and it is very clearly an insertion, it is one of 60 third-person insertions in John. It was edited by the Greeks, because when you say a feast day of the Jews, it means you're not a Jew. When you refer to the author of the gospel as him, it means you're not him.
You would just say what the feast was.
Yes.
You wouldn't say there was a feast of the Jews. That just shows their ignorance.
The Gentiles didn't know what these feasts were. If you'll show this slide we have, they were not mentioned in the other gospels. They all mentioned the final Passover. But in John, and it's a good thing, he did mention all of them. That was necessary for the Greek readers, but they're very ignorant of them. So when they you have each one of the feast days mentioned in order, which fulfills the testimony of the other scriptures that it was 1 year. But then when they inserted in John 6:4 a Passover, a feast day of the Jews, in error, that
at the
blows
end
up
of the
entire
summer,
right.
So you add a whole half year of dead silence in.
Right, and because Passover's in the spring.
Right, and to get to a Passover he never goes up to.
Right.
And everyone is required to go up to it.
They are required to.
Nobody shows up to it. Even Pharisees are in the Galilee at this time.
Right. So he's mentioning in the same breath that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is nigh. How are we going to find leavened bread for this crowd? Which makes no sense. It is an insertion, but it's out of context when you see the verses that come before and after it. And also he takes John 5:1, which just says a feast day of the Jews, and he says that's another Passover. So what you get...
Oh, that's what Eusebius came up with.
Yes, that's another Passover.
Saying that John 5, which is clearly Shavuot, 7 weeks after the day of first fruits of Passover of John 2 and 3.
Right.
There's no other feast there. It is the feast that's required, and he turns that into another Passover a year later.
Because you have to have 4 Passovers to have 3.5 years.
Right.
So he had to insert 2 Passovers, not just one.
Right.
So he said 5:1 was another Passover.
That's why I call him an ignorant heretic.
Right.
That's what he was. Ignorant of the feast of the Lord.
If you're inserting things in the Bible that don't belong there, you are a heretic. And this is what I did, if you can see this chart. Now, I took this from your work. So all the little numbers you can't see, those are the event numbers in the chronological gospel.
Okay.
And what I'm trying to show here, to cover for their 3.5-year ministry, Eusebius slipped into John 6:4, they will say, well, the Gospels, they weren't in strict chronological order, they jumped around. Well, look at this. I bracketed 4 common events in the Gospels and mentioned in each one of the Gospels, not counting John 6:4. And you can say they are very consistent. They're very consistent in the order of these events that happen. So these events were the baptism of Yeshua, which is mentioned in all the Gospels. The baptism of water is not mentioned in John, but the baptism of the Spirit is. So I did cluster graphing. You had more strict criteria. The next one was the feeding of the 5,000, followed by the events of the Last Supper and the arrest of Yeshua, and then the final resurrection events, including the ascension. So all of these were mentioned 2 or 3 times. Some of the elements were mentioned, so we can be sure these things were mentioned in there. So you had those 4 brackets, and here they are without all the little tiny event numbers. And you can see, again, very consistent, very consistent. So if there were 3.5 years in John, this is what it would look like. You have the 70-week ministry of Yeshua and the other 3 Gospels that is contradicted by the 3.5-year Gospel in John. And that just doesn't work. Besides which, it makes it real evident to see that nothing happened in the first 2 years of his ministry after he was baptized. Nothing happened for 2 years.
Nothing worth recording.
Yeah, so that doesn't make any sense, and it also contradicts what he said. Yeshua said, "You have witnessed the acceptable year of the Lord." Now I'm gonna take a couple years off, and then we'll get started, right? That's
to preach the acceptable year of the Lord, and he took a break.
Right. So the 3.5 ministry doesn't work, and
now we run into another problem in that is that if you have a 3.5-year ministry, from his ministry's beginning, you have skewed out the entire timeline, and the Passovers don't work.
Yes,
nothing works after that.
And you would also have to, if this were true, 3.5-year ministry, you would have had multiple mentions of the feast days, and there's only one for each feast day.
Right.
So we can be pretty sure John was right in line with the same chronology of the other 3 Gospels, does not contradict their testimony. And we know for a fact that John 6:4 was an insertion because it says it is. He said a feast day of the Jews. This is a Greek editor putting this in there. And there are 60 of these in John. So we know it says in the signature page at the end of John that we know his testimony is true. So the editors are telling you, they're telling you straight out, they got these materials and they wrote down John's testimony and they know it's true. Referring to him, we know his testimony is true. These are third-person assertions by a Greek editor. Try to explain them away. It doesn't matter. It's all BS. The overwhelming probability is that it was written by someone else.
They are glowing to a Jewish believer. They can see it. You know, we have found the Messiah, which is being interpreted the Christ.
Right. Oh yeah. Well, this is. Are you thinking of the Samaritan woman at the well?
No, I'm thinking about when Andrew went and found Peter.
Yes.
We found the Messiah, which is interpreted the Christ.
Yes.
You know, interpreted in language we don't even speak.
Exactly.
The Christ. That's stupid.
And that happened again with his encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well. And she says to him, well, I know that the Messiah comes who is called the Christ. See, now, there weren't even any, there not only were no Greek Gospels at the time, there were no Greek believers at the time.
Right, these are Samaritans.
Right, so
you know, they write in Paleo-Hebrew to this day. They speak in Hebrew.
Right, so who's going to be calling him the Christ before there are any Greek believers or any Greek Gospels?
Yeah,
it's not going to happen. So those words were put into her mouth in order to authenticate the Greek Christ. Just like they put Easter into Acts after the fact to authenticate the name of the pagan holiday as the holiday, you know, of Passover. And it says in the Greek manuscript, it actually says it was Pascha, which comes from Pesach. It was Passover. It wasn't Easter. Easter literally is another day. You know, and they did it then so they would not be worshiping at the same time as the Jews and the Messianics. They purposefully wanted to totally cut themselves off from the Jews and not do anything that they were doing. So they literally, and they weren't even coy about it, they literally replaced the sacred feast days with pagan feast days.
Feast of the Lord, and now they replace it with the reincarnation of the wife of Nimrod.
Yes, the queen of all things. The queen of heaven.
Queen of heaven.
Who created a rabbit that lays eggs. And we all are still chasing that rabbit.
Doing that today,
We're still chasing that rabbit. So to kind of defend themselves against this, they came up with these two Gospels of John that had 6:4 in it that they claim were from the 2nd century.
Yeah, tell us about that. P66 and 7.
Right, P66 and 74 in the Bodmer collection there, P. Bodmer 2 and 15. So they analyze these. Brett Nongbre, who's great paleological linguist, he's really great. He said, well, all this collection came from the Pacomanian monastery, the Greek monastery. It was in Egypt. But they're all from the 4th and 5th century. The monastery was established in the 4th century. So these are the works of the scribe of that monastery over the next couple of centuries. But then they pick two of them out and date them 200 years earlier. Obviously, to cover for the 3.5-year ministry, you know, promulgated in John 6:4. But when you look at them, if you can put this up on the screen,
let's look at them.
The ones in red, two Gospels, they dated centuries earlier than the others, and they're different Greek manuscripts. But if you just take the other biblical, they were Coptic Greek manuscripts, you can see the same thing. They're all 4th and 5th century. And then they're going to tell you, yeah, but these two Gospels of John, they're 2nd century. Well, it just doesn't work. When he analyzes the content of them themselves, it's not just the context. When he analyzes the content, they come up with this. This is the Tau Rho stargram, it's called, which is the sign of the cross. The sign of the cross was not put into the creed until Constantine in the 4th century. The word cross is not in the Greek New Testament anywhere. So when Constantine puts in the creed in the 4th century, and they use this starogram of the cross in that codex, that comes from the 4th century. The binding comes from the 4th century. The content of the phrasing comes from the 4th century. In fact, it agrees 95% with the wording in the Codex Vaticanus, which comes from the 4th century. this is a 4th century document. It's clearly to cover their tracks on misidentifying.
So they deliberately misidentified this to bring it to an early time frame to try to get John 6:4 legitimized.
Right.
And it's not. It is abhorrent. It is a complete destruction of the gospel chronology. It makes Yeshua's ministry pure nonsense.
It does. And this was one of the 2 big pillars in the Roman church that they used to hammer the other churches in obedience, because they were heretics. They were wrong thinkers, right? And the Roman church took unto itself the authority to actually execute any of their believers that was thinking wrongly, was thinking heretically. So there's a second pillar. First one was the 3.5-year ministry. This also affected the second great pillar, which is changing the day of worship from the Sabbath day, as it says in the Bible in the 10 Commandments, to the Lord's day, right? So because 3.5-year ministry pushes his crucifixion up 2 more years. Right, from 31 AD, and you can see in 31 AD, he fulfills the sign of Jonah. On twilight of Wednesday, April 25th, Passover that year, he goes into the tomb and he rises from the tomb in the evening, in the twilight, the evening of the Sabbath day, right? On the Sabbath day at the end of it, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Yeah,
but when
absolutely.
you move it up 2 more years to 33 AD, then Passover happens on Friday, April the 3rd. So he is put in the tomb in the evening. He spends 1 night. Then Saturday day, 1 day, Saturday night, 1 night. Then he arises in the morning. And it says in Scripture, they arrived there at the tomb before the first light of the morning, and he was already gone, because he'd already risen the evening before. He's already gone. So that's only 3 days, half of the sign of Jonah.
So you really have severe biblical revisionism, historical revisionism, literally fake news, the narrative of the day, which was to meld pagan sun god worship in with the Bible. This is Constantine saying.